Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to start off with a question. Can you give me a show of hands? How many of you actually work in procurement in the public sector? How many of you work? Okay, it's a fair number. And how about those that supply the public sector or would like to supply the public sector? Right, okay, so there's a fair few of those. I'm going to be talking this afternoon. I've entitled the talk, Cutting Costs and Keeping the Faith. Can public sector maximise value for money and address the economic development agenda? And I think Andrew's talk has led very nicely into some of the things that I have to say. I think, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution made by my colleagues who are with me today, Chris Lee and Scott Parfitt. Can you just give him a wave? Chris has been the co-author with me on Barriers to Procurement Opportunity report that we did for Valley Wales, and Scott and I are working together on a project for Cardiff City Council at the moment, and Scott also manages a knowledge transfer partnership that we're working on with Cardiff, and I'm indebted to them. This is their presentation as much as it is mine. I'd like to start off by talking about the cost-cutting agenda that those of us who work in the public sector are all too well aware of. I have to say that I was a public sector buyer for more than 20 years before I sort of poacher-turned-gamekeeper became an academic. And I still talk about we as public sector procurement people. I'm still very much aligned to that. And we are now facing unprecedented cuts in funding and major reforms. The Comprehensive Spending Review gave us the toughest cuts since World War II. 400,000 jobs lost, depending on which newspaper you read. No department or service spared. But in the face of those difficulties, we still have to maintain frontline services. We know all about doing more with less. We have to cut costs, but we don't have to cut services. It has put procurement on the front line. And one thing I would like to say is I was a little disappointed that so many people thought, when the question was asked this morning, is public sector procurement as efficient as the private sector? Well, one of the people that I know very well, a guy called Hugh Williams, who came from the private sector to the public sector after he'd been there 6 months, I said, do you find it very different? And he said, well, it's procurement, but with one hand tied behind your back. And he said that does make the job more difficult. And for those of us who work in public sector procurement, we are contributing to the health of our nation, we're contributing to the education of our children, and we are buying the care for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and we don't do that job lightly. So, however efficient or otherwise we think we're doing, I think we do deserve a bit of a pat on the back for doing what is often a very difficult job, and we're facing a very difficult situation at the moment. But we've also got the economic development agenda to consider, and I suppose the raison d'etre of the public sector is social innovation. And we can't ignore the fact that our local authorities, as I'm sure Andrew will agree, are expected to be supporting local employment, the local economy, the businesses within that area. We have economic development departments that are there to develop those businesses. There's an increasing need to support, develop and grow local businesses, and particularly small local businesses, because that's where the growth is. It's not in the large firms. They are downsizing. Any growth in employment will come from the small business sector. We've got to help our SMEs to become more competitive, and we've got to give local businesses a hand up, not a hand out. Very often they can tell us, well, we could get a grant for training, we could get a money for this, we could get a service provided here, but what we'd really like is regular business from the public sector. That's what we want. That would develop and grow our business. And what we need to be looking at is SME-friendly policies and procedures that allow the businesses to get a fair crack at what we have to offer in the public sector. Now, I've put this in a Welsh perspective because obviously it's what I know best. You might have guessed from my accent. 157,000 small businesses in Wales, 99% of all the businesses in Wales. There are 90-plus public sector organisations, give or take a few quangos, but we don't call them that, of course. And they spend in Wales about £5 billion per annum on goods and services. Now, the obvious thing is, if 25% of that spend was with those small businesses, that would be £1.25 billion injected into the local economy, jobs would be created, businesses would be sustained, and everybody would be happy. So what's the problem? Well, of course, the problem is it is not that simple. Now, my colleagues and I have a bit of a history here, and we have to admit to the fact that we've been round these arguments for a long time. We've been looking for the solution. It is our own personal quest for the Holy Grail. Chris and I started work on this back in 1999, when Newport City Council said to us, small business is saying, even though we've got big public sector organisations, big private sector organisations, they're not getting a share of the spend. Is it true? And what can we do about it? And we looked into it, and we told them. And time went on. And then the WDA, when they existed, commissioned us to write a report on SME engagement in public sector procurement. And Chris and I were involved with that back in 2001, and we made our recommendations. And to be fair, quite a few of our recommendations out of that were actually put in place. And since then, we've had Better Value Wales, we've had Releasing Resources to the Front Line, we've had Opening Doors, the Charter for SME-Friendly Procurement in Wales. And as I said, we wrote the Barriers to Procurement Opportunity just last year. We're now working on Source Cardiff, all asking the same question. How can we create that engagement between the local economy, the small businesses, and the public sector? Now, we're faced with these cost-cutting priorities in the supply chain, and I don't need to tell you what those priorities are. Category management is going up the agenda significantly, taking a strategic approach, forward planning, rationalisation. And just this week, John Collington, the head of the Cabinet Office's Efficiency and Reform Group, announced the 9 categories to start the central government's procurement model, and he is expecting to save 25% over 4 years from the existing baseline of 13 billion. That is a big ask. It's a big expectation. And that, of course, will have consequences. By the way, the best question of the day undoubtedly goes to someone who in the last section asked, what is the job of the OGC? Answers on a postcard, please. Aggregation and collaboration are bound to result from category management, and we're already doing that anyway. Increased advertising. We're getting increasingly the word that we need to be advertising more so that the small business community has greater access to public sector opportunities. And so we're looking now at advertising things over 25,000. And e-procurement, of course, reducing transaction costs. Now, the arguments for category management are well rehearsed. Justification of spend, rationalisation, standardisation. Rationalisation of the supplier base. We've seen a local authority suggest that they went down from 15,000 suppliers to 4,000. Where are the small businesses in that? Taking a strategic approach to planning and forecasting should give us better information. Birmingham City reporting £36 million savings, so perhaps John Collington isn't quite so far off in his estimate. But this is likely to reduce SME access to public sector procurement opportunities because our contracts are going to get larger, our opportunities are going to get fewer. And when we talk about aggregation and collaboration, now in Wales we have a history of aggregation and collaboration. Certainly in the NHS we've been collaborating on an all-Wales basis for about 30 years, and since 1974, the unitary authority, the county councils, and now the unitary authority since 1996 have collaborated. But as Philip Green suggested, we've got a long way to go there. There's a lot more that we can do to lever advantage. Framework agreements, contracts to reduce transaction costs, consortia contracting, all of these mean that the smaller companies have less opportunity to come in as first-tier suppliers, and they argue that by being second- or third-tier suppliers, they're less profitable and more uncertain. So it's not a happy place to be. Increased advertising. It was promoted in the Opening Doors Charter and in our Barriers report that advertising of over 25,000 was the recommendation, even though there was a potential to increase the workload for public sector buyers who may be inundated with interest in those contracts. We are now seeing that the evidence suggests it's not necessarily the case. moving away from the old practice of approved lists and suitability tested through a pre-qualification process,